We are going to continue our discussion on classification and how living things are organized. And we are going to start discussing the hierarchy of how living things are classified from a large group to a more specific group. So let's talk about bringing in the royalty and talk about kingdoms. So, what are kingdoms? Kingdoms are groups of organisms that have a certain number of basic similarities. So, not necessarily kingdoms like kings and queens and castles and things like that. But when we're talking about a kingdom, we're talking about organisms that have the same number or the similar characteristics, rather, that would group them together. So, for example, organisms that make their own food, autotrophs, would be plants. Those would all go into a certain kingdom. Or animals that have a backbone and also have to seek out their own food would go into their own kingdom. So that is how scientists classify living organisms in that way. There are actually six different kingdoms, and we are going to touch briefly on them right now, and then we are going to delve further into them as we get towards the end of this classification unit. So, what's the deal with these six kingdoms? What are they? So, here are the six kingdoms that are known today. The first king, or every single living thing, is a member of one of the following kingdoms. So anything that is living falls into one of these current six kingdoms. There's the animal kingdom, which we belong to, the plant kingdom, the protist kingdom, the fungi kingdom, the archaebacteria kingdom, and the eubacteria kingdom. The one thing that I do want to point out is that these are actually quite fluid and dynamic. So that means that they do change. A long time ago, there was just animals and plants that were the two major kingdoms. And then as new species were discovered, or there were similarities and differences that were discovered through further analyzation of organisms, they found that they didn't really fit into those certain kingdoms. So they created a new kingdom. So there is still many species being discovered today, and that is why I'm saying that this is not a definite number of kingdoms that we will have forever. This could change as more organisms are discovered. So here's a way to look at kind of how the six kingdoms are classified. So, like I mentioned, we are part of the animal kingdom or the Animalia kingdom. And the organisms that are in this kingdom are multicellular, which we know is more than one cell, and have eukaryotic cells. Plants also are multicellular and eukaryotic, but the thing that's different about that is that plants make their own food, so they fall into their own category and they perform photosynthesis. Fungi are multicellular and eukaryotic, however, they are saprophotic, so they actually break down dead, decomposing matter to absorb the nutrients in that way. Then there was this random group of organisms that were discovered that weren't quite plants because sometimes they moved. They weren't quite animals because sometimes they make their own food. So the Protista or Protist kingdom was created to include these organisms that didn't quite fit into any of the current kingdoms. So they are eukaryotic, they can be unicellular or multicellular. But key thing, remember that the eukaryotic cells will have a nucleus as well as membrane covered organelles. Now, there are also two other kingdoms, the eubacteria and the archaebacteria. A while back, there used to just be a bacteria kingdom, but further investigation of those kind of showed that there needed to be two separate kingdoms because the archaebacteria, while they are both unicellular and prokaryotic, meaning they don't have a nucleus and they don't have membrane covered organelles, archaebacteria are bacteria and they're prokaryotic, but they're really found more in very extreme conditions. So either very hot conditions, like near a thermal vent, or near areas where there's a lot of methane gas produced. So those are going to be organisms that will fall more into the Archaebacteria kingdom. Where on the other hand, eubacteria organisms are still unicellular and prokaryotic, but those are the more common forms of bacteria that not only live naturally in our digestive systems, but also are the things that infect us and make us sick. So, this is the six major kingdoms that we have as of today. So, even though there is the major kingdoms, within those kingdoms, there is even a broader way that we can break this down to go from a very general kingdom to a very specific to one species of organism. So, here are the levels of classification. You have a domain, which for current purposes, we have eukarya and archaebacteria and bacteria. And then the domain can be broken down further into a kingdom. The kingdoms can then be broken down into phylums. Phylums can be specified even more, but into a class. And then classes can be specified more into orders of organisms. And then the order can even be specified further into families. And the families can be specified further into genuses. And then finally, that genus is specified into species. So the key thing that I want to realize here is that as we progress down through the levels of classification, you have many more organisms that go all the way down to one specific kind of organism. And the main thing that separates these things are their similarities and the physical characteristics that they have. An easy way to remember the levels of classification are as follows. So I have a little easy way to remember this, an easy mnemonic device to remember this. You can come up with your own, but each of the letters, now on a mnemonic device, each of the letters stands for one of the levels of classification. But they do go in order, like I mentioned, from the most broadest, all encompassing level to a very, very specific singular species. So the order is very important. So when we look at this, my mnemonic device is: did King Philip come over for grape soda? So when you look at that, the D, the K, the P correspond to domain, kingdom, phylum. So it helps you keep these levels of classification in the order that they are, from most broad and all encompassing to a very, very specific species. Here's a visual that I wanted to share with you. So, like I mentioned, the domain is the largest group. These are the eukaryotes. So, within this domain, you're going to find the kingdoms that we are discussing, such as organisms that are eukaryotic. So, if you look to the picture to the right, you can see there's a human, there's a lion, there's a dog, a fish, a snake, a mushroom. Plants would even be fitting in there too, like with that evergreen tree. So anything that is eukaryotic is going to fall into the domain eukarya. The other domains will not have any of these organisms because they will not be eukaryotic. Now, below that, within that eukaryotic domain, it can be further down into the different kingdoms. So within that, you'll have the plant kingdom, you will have the fungi kingdom, and then in this example, we will have the animal kingdom. So these are mostly multicellular and they're heterotrophic, meaning they need to seek out or obtain their own food. And so one thing's that if you look at the comparison between the domain and the kingdom, you'll notice that the tree and the mushroom are no longer part of this kingdom. Now, if I take the kingdom and I further specialize it into categories with only animals with a backbone, that actually eliminates some of my organisms there. So you can see like the butterfly is no longer part of the phylum Chordata because a butterfly does not have a spinal cord. That's what a chordatas are a backbone. Then I can take that phylum, and if I were to even further specify it or classify it, I could talk about mammals. So these are animals that have sweat glands and produce milk for their offspring. And generally, we also say too that they have fur or some type of hair. So when we look at this, now the fish are no longer included. The snake is no longer included in this class, Mammalia. Now, if I were to take the Mammalia class or the mammal class and further it down even more to get more specific and more precise, if I said that the next order is Carnivora, which is carnivores, where they are mostly meat-eating animals, you look at the animals that are kind of eliminated now. So now humans are now no longer included, if you'll notice, because we are omnivores. We are not considered carnivores. And you can also notice that the mouse and the deer are now eliminated too because they are herbivores, or sometimes they're omnivores too. If you think about, I think more really more herbivores. So you can see how we're getting from very broad in general to very specific, right? And then if you look at the family, if we look at the Canidae family, which are wolves, foxes, coyotes, and jackals. So these are, if you think about it, kind of along the lines of getting closer to like the actual specific species. So now the aardvark, I believe that is, and the seal and the are no longer included, as well as the lion, because they are not considered part of this family. Now, if I were to continue down to the genus, you'll notice that now we're talking about the Canis genus, which includes dogs, wolves, coyotes, and jackals, so like the canines, if you will. And there are specific characteristics that would eliminate the foxes from this category. And then furthering down into the Canis lupus, which would be dogs and wolves. So kind of having that more very specific, maybe relating to their snout structure or how many young they reproduce. There's lots of things that go into specifying this. But as we got from domain all the way down to species, the criteria became more and more specific to those species. This is another visualization, as you can see. Like we go from our largest, one of the second largest grouping is our kingdom, Animalia. You can see that it includes the bears as well as a fox and a squirrel and a snake and a sea star. And then if we start to look at including that phylum Chordata once again, which is the phylum that has the backbone, the sea star is now eliminated because it is not included into this phylum. And then if we look at mammals, now the snake is no longer included because it does not have sweat glands, it does not have fur, it does not give birth to live young. And then we get into carnivores, so then the squirrel is eliminated because he's an herbivore. And then you get into the family Ursidae, which really has to do more with bears and their physical structures and their bone structures and anatomy. And then you get into the genus Ursus, and then finally into the Ursus actus. So when we're looking at these things, the physical characteristics are what's separating them. So this concludes this video on this section of notes. Please do feel free to go back and rewatch it, look at the pictures more, and kind of see how when we're talking about levels of classification, we're going from very broad, general, all-inclusive almost groupings down to a very specific one species.